Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
The Memory Tapes is a podcast series and accompanying book from the National Library of Australia, edited by oral historian Dr Shirleene Robinson AM. The Memory Tapes brings history to life through the voices of the people who lived it, to reveal the people behind Australia's history. Today I'm joined by Dr Barbara Lemon, Director of Curatorial and Collection Research at the National Library of Australia, to talk about the Memory Tapes and this remarkable collection of Australian voices and the stories they tell. Dr Barbara Lemon, welcome to the Good Reading podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we dive into this really fascinating collection, tell me, what is oral history and what does it tell us about our history that other collections can't?
Sure. Well, oral history is a lived experience, I suppose. It's history by voice. It's history by memory. And obviously, oral histories have been told for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but oral history as a perhaps a more formal discipline is the recording of those life stories. Here at the National Library, we have a style of recording oral history which is, I suppose you could say, birth to the present, cradle to not quite grave, because obviously you're not in your grave if you're reflecting on your life. But it's really about telling life stories in order to shed light on events or themes of perhaps greater national significance. Our oral history collection began with recordings with people who were perhaps quite well known, often writers or authors or politicians and so on, but it has evolved over time to include a huge amount of social history. So that's, if you like, everyday lives that combined tell us a bigger story. And it's different to other collections because it's a highly democratic form of history recording, of storytelling. It's open to anybody, anywhere, and that's the beauty of it.
And how is oral history collected and how is it catalogued and stored?
We collect oral histories primarily by commissioning them. So we work with oral historians who are trained in the art of interviewing, not in a journalistic style, but in a way that encourages the interviewee to take time to reflect, to follow tangents where necessary, but to be gently guided through the telling of their own life story. We do collect a small number of what we call formed collections, which are recordings that have taken place for other purposes by other people in other places at other times, but that might be highly nationally significant and needing preservation. The catch with that sometimes is that when we commission histories, oral histories, we have very clear rights agreements around those in order to provide public access to them. When you're collecting older formed collections, it can be harder to get those rights really clarified. And of course, the National Library's primary aim is to make the material we hold accessible to the public. Ultimately, that's what we're here for. Oral history is catalogued as any other collection format would be, as in recording by recording. Each recording has its own entry in the catalogue, and we include a whole lot of subject tags in there so that people can readily find that material. A lot of oral history is recorded as part of a broader project, so we would also catalogue that broader project in helping people to find the material. We also, the National Library, have our catalogue obviously very strongly connected to Trove, which is perhaps the best known entry point to our collections. And those oral histories that are publicly accessible, that is to say the interviewee has allowed us permission to make them open to the public immediately, they can be listened to through the Trove website.
Where, when and how did the collection start and how does it shape our documented history?
The collection started with Hazel de Burgh. So Hazel de Burgh was a pioneering oral historian in Australia. Her first recorded oral history was in 1957, and she was in her mid-40s by the time she started this work. But really it came almost by accident. Hazel was reading books for the blind, and this brought to mind for her the power or the potential of having the authors themselves read their books, or at least introduce their books and speak from the heart about their own writing. So that led her to start a whole lot of other recordings, initially with poets and writers, but that then evolved. By the early 1960s, her work had come to the attention of Sir Harold White, who was the first national librarian, and it was Sir Harold White who invited Hazel de Burgh to effectively join the staff of the National Library and to contribute her recordings to date to the National Collection to be preserved and transcribed. That's something she was very passionate about, the preservation and transcription, and ultimately the public access to those recordings. So from there, she was contracted to record something like 60 interviews every year, a pretty prodigious output. And she ended up recording close to 1,300 interviews over the course of her life. She died in 1984, and by then the National Library's oral history collection was well underway. So Hazel really started it, but it has now become a huge part of the National Collection. It's obviously expanded to having many more oral historians on the job. We now have around 80 people around the country who do commissioned recordings for us, and the collection is sitting at over 24,000 interviews.
In the book, I was intrigued to read the National Library referred to as a cultural memory institution. What is meant by that, and how is that reflected in the library's collection?
Yeah, it's a lovely phrase in a way. I suppose it takes us beyond being a repository of publications and materials and archives, which of course we are as well. But a cultural memory institution means we really are holding materials of all kinds that in some way hold, reflect, contribute to a collective memory of ourselves as a nation. And obviously, a national memory is a very, very complex and multifaceted thing. And it's fair to say that our collections are too.
In the introduction to the Memory Tapes book, there's the idea that the collection captures not only history, facts, opinions, life stories, but also this thing called emotional truth. What does emotional truth communicate about Australia and Australians beyond the mere words and phrases?
Emotional truth comes out, I think, particularly in oral history. There's a quote from Hazel de Burgh, our pioneering oral historian, who was really moved by the hesitancy before speaking when you're listening to someone reflect, recall. That's what builds a connection with the person through the audio, that immediacy of memory. So it's not simply, I was born in 1967 and this event occurred 9 years later. It's much more about the feelings of reliving that time coming through as you're hearing that voice. And I think the richness that that brings to a revisiting of the past in any form, voice adds so much more to our understanding of what has occurred in the past. And particularly when we have multiple lenses upon an event or different people remembering the same thing in a different way with different vocal tone. And I think there's such an immediacy to audio, there's such an immediacy to the voice. It can just cut through what might otherwise be a dry chapter of a history book and take us there.
Before we take a closer look at the collection, what's the breadth of representation in the collection?
Absolutely enormous. It's almost impossible to quantify. I was alluding to before, I would need a lifetime myself to become fully acquainted with the content of this collection, which is over 58,000 hours of audio. To give you a sense, I suppose some of the larger standout projects that make up the collection, and it's worth noting that the collection is made up of a series of over 500 projects, which are themed in and of themselves. So that perhaps gives you a sense of the breadth to begin with, but we could point to everything from the bicentennial oral history project, which recorded memories of Australians up to 1938, the Bringing Them Home collection, which was recorded with people who had experienced separation from their families following the national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. Cultural context of unemployment was a huge project. Forgotten Australians and former child migrants. Australian responses to COVID-19, more recently, Australian responses to AIDS. We have a lot of collections around natural disaster. We also have lots of science-focused collections and multicultural collections, Maltese Australians, Lebanese Australians, Polish Australians, Fijian, Chinese, Indian diaspora, it goes on. So the stream that's running through all of that is a kind of a general stream of oral history in which we approach individuals who have played a nationally significant role in their lives and in their careers, and we record their stories alongside those more formal, formed, themed projects. We have a very long-running project which tailed off last year called 7 Years On. That ran for a good 30 years, recording the lives and experiences of Aboriginal leaders. So I think you can get the sense that it's as big as you want it to be, any subject that you are interested in, from glass blowing to poetry to the writing of history to filmmaking and political activism, you will find it in there.
And I guess I can assume that the project is ongoing, the collection is ongoing.
Very much so, yeah. In recent years, we have been adding up to 1,000 hours a year to the collection, growing at a very rapid rate. That fluctuates. It depends on resourcing. It depends on what projects we are funded to do. But the program is a continuing stream here at the National Library that has a permanent place in the curatorial area.
That sounds like a lot of hard drives.
A hell of a lot of hard drives, absolutely. Digital storage is always on our minds. Audio is fairly, it packs a punch with digital storage. So we do think about that all the time, all of our magnetic tape and our backup tapes. And we are fortunate to be in the position where the entire collection has been digitised. So that includes older material that was recorded on reel-to-reel tapes and so on. But again, yeah, I think nobody can quite see the future when it comes to the cost of digital storage. That's a subject that we are always returning to here.
The Memory Tapes offers listeners a rare opportunity to hear Australians tell their stories in their own words. The recordings capture not only historical and social milestones and significant events, but they also include national disasters.
So I thought, I'll have a good look at the radar screen, and that was when I began to get worried. I saw that image on the radar. I don't like to talk in cliches, but you'd have to say it's a life-changing experience. Cyclone Tracy.
Always very moving and quite wonderful in a strange way to hear the voice of somebody who experienced something firsthand, recalling that experience. And oftentimes they're recalling that experience for the first time in a long time. So the emotion that they felt at the time is at the fore.
Mem Fox is one of Australia's best-known authors of children's books, including Possum Magic and Where is the Green Sheep? In this excerpt, we're acquainted with a little-known fact about Mem's early life.
And he held out his hand, an immigration officer held out his hand, shook my hand, and said, "Welcome home, Marion."
So something like this, a simple sentence, a simple recollection, and you can hear in a sense, the warmth and emotion that she feels, that Mem feels in recalling that moment, can point to a whole lot of things, can encapsulate a moment in Australian history, can tell us something about migration, can tell us something about the complexity of what it means to be Australian or to belong anywhere, and to be a beloved, well-known children's author, very much associated with Australia, but to have that particular experience in her background that may well be unknown to many who love and read her work to their children.
The memory tapes documents important political and social milestones in a unique way. Peter Black delivers an insight into the pathway to acceptance for the referendum on marriage equality.
But I think what's often overlooked about how we won marriage equality in this country, it really was a grassroots movement. That wasn't one campaign, but hundreds and thousands of local campaigns.
I think this is the beauty of some of the interviews we've captured, which touch on nationally significant events that people would think they have a pretty solid grasp of, and give us a glimpse into what was actually going on behind those things, who was working to make them happen. And on a completely different topic, it makes me think of some of the interviews we have behind the COVID-19 project, for example, which is an experience that touched absolutely everybody, but it's incredible just how much information and what kinds of experiences come through the recordings for that project that I think would surprise many or all who had a deep listen. And Peter Black's interview here brings back, I think, a period of quite recent history that most of us are going to think we recall pretty well. But as we know, within even a few years of a major event occurring, it can start to fade in the collective memory. And I think it's so critical that interviews like this are there to remind us what really happened, what people really had to go through, how hard they had to fight, and how they had to fight to bring about something that we now take for granted as part of our everyday social and political fabric.
Recording the personal experiences of times past is very much part of the collection too. Kim Bear reflecting on being a teenager in 1972.
That was such a momentous time to turn into a teenager. It was Gough Whitlam, it was feminism, it was Cleo magazine. They were incredible times.
Although a lot of our interviews are with people in the later part of their lives, there is something quite powerful about their reflections about the earlier times in their lives. And I think this is a great example of that, where we may have a recorded account of the Whitlam era, for example, or many recorded accounts from many different perspectives, but for somebody to be able to reflect anecdotally, quite casually, on what it was like to be 13, 14, 17, at that time, brings it to life, I think, in a completely different way. We do try to include in the collection, where possible, younger perspectives, but that's an interesting question, which is tangential to the question you've asked me, but just about when is the right time to record an oral history? What is a life story? You can record a life story when you're 22, but if you are a public figure, you're going to have a very different view on that 22-year-old when they're 62. And so there's part of the art of oral history, I think, is finding the right moment in that person's life to do the reflecting that we want them to do. And in some cases, that's why we interview people periodically. It's certainly not the norm, but we have many interviews in the collection where somebody has been interviewed at 5 or 10 year intervals to capture that change in their own recollections of something. And you can absolutely see the way the narrative shifts as they age. I think in that particular excerpt, you can hear almost the nostalgia of the teenage memory. It's different to interviewing him as a teenager during the Whitlam era, and I would be fascinated to be able to hear both things lined up one against the next, if that were even possible.
When you mentioned the COVID pandemic a few moments ago, I wondered if you could think back to the Spanish flu epidemic in the early 20th century. how we might be able to compare those two.
Yes, unfortunately, we do have recordings in the collection that touch on that. Obviously, the oral history collection and indeed the National Library didn't exist at that time, but recordings from the 60s included people who could remember it. And it's absolutely comparable. And I think it's one of those great examples of why it matters to record history in this way. People facing the COVID-19 pandemic would understandably feel as if that was the first time any such thing had occurred. It was so unprecedented, it was so out of the blue, and it can be quite not exactly reassuring, but somewhat stabilizing to realize, though, these huge, transformative, socially incredibly challenging, rather terrifying experiences are not unprecedented. And indeed, it's important to go back and have a listen to how people remember things like isolation, things like a change in behaviour from one human to another, suspicion of one another, and of course the positive side of the story in terms of communities coming together and helping one another so that we can be informed and warned by those experiences as we go into our own modern iteration of them.
The voices of First Nations people form an important part of the collection too, and it's where an ancient oral tradition meets a more recent one.
To Aborigines, we do not own the land. The land owns us because we are part of the land. According to our culture and our beliefs and our spiritual beliefs, we are part of the land. We are all one.
What are the challenges in building an oral history collection with tens of thousands of years behind it?
It's a really great question, and it's one that we're grappling with at the moment because we're in the process of co-designing a training program for First Nations oral history interviewers. So what we found, and in working with Dr Lorena Barker, who is an Indigenous oral historian and an expert in this area, is that there are two styles, if you like, not only two, but the two that we're looking at of recording oral history that are absolutely chalk and cheese. The National Cultural Institution style, which is quite formal, which involves being in a quiet room, it involves high audio quality, it's one-to-one, there's a kind of formality even in that of people face-to-face, there's an intensity in that, and it's about from birth to the current day. It's chronological. It tends to be. If you put that up against techniques in Indigenous oral history storytelling, which draw from those oral history storytelling traditions that go back years and years and years, centuries, then you can see some curious differences, I suppose, in an Indigenous community oral history tradition. There would be much more tolerance for things like interviewing in groups or interviewing with more than one person, interviewing outside. You can imagine that the connections the audio engineers in an institution have with that, because you've got background noise, you've got birds, you've got people shuffling around, you've got lots of audio interference. Somebody might even be making craft at the time that they're talking, or indeed importance of place comes through those interviews so much that it might be felt to be appropriate to record the interview by a river, so that the memories of that place come to the fore. That place is what releases, if you like, the recall that's being searched for as part of that practice. And there's something very gentle, there's something very slow about it. So the other thing is that understanding of time. It's not necessarily chronological. It might be cyclical. It might be thematic. There might be a sense that a member of the community doesn't have the cultural permission, if you like, to talk about certain things in a certain way. So I think that you are right, that there is very much, not so much attention there as a confluence of two extremely different outlooks. But what that has meant is that we've been fortunate to work with a very large number of First Nations people now over the course of the history of the collection in arriving at a kind of compromise. A lot of those individuals have had very prominent public roles and are quite comfortable with the more formal style of interviewing. But in some cases, we have had oral historians go into community, go on country and do interviews in various other settings where the audio may not be so perfect, but the content is extraordinary. We do have a very high proportion of First Nations interviewees in the contemporary collection, and Peter Reid and Jackie Huggins' joint project, 7 years on, recording the lives of Aboriginal leaders, is a pretty extraordinary addition to the collection. There's around 245 interviews in that one alone.
And Neville Bonner delivers quite a powerful message.
Absolutely, and I think it's a message that today is very familiar to most of us, but perhaps when he recorded it, less so. And it shows the courage, I think, of some of our earlier Aboriginal leaders and political activists, as well as the contemporary political activists. But I think that courage to continue to put across that message, and in this case, to put it down in a formal, arranged interview with a essentially government-funded cultural institution. There's a generosity in that, there's a determination in that, which is really important and which continues to come through contemporary interviews that we're recording.
One of the best things you can actually have in preparation is your butane gas stove with some butane gas bottles, because when crap goes down, your butane gas stove is going to be there for you. And I know I make light of things, because one of the things you do in this, even when things are terrible, is you must find a way in which you can maintain hope. Having a light moment of laughter is how you do that.
So capturing everyday stories from people's lives is very much part of that project, as we've just heard from Ronnie Aliff. And it reminds us that there are still moments of joy, even in the most difficult of times.
So this is another really moving excerpt from a project which I think has left an imprint on the minds of all of the oral historians who worked within it, certainly those I've spoken to. It was an important project because it was truly a community partnership. This one was recorded with the Cobargo Bushfire Resilience Centre. It was very much hand in hand. We had our then senior curator of the collection and oral historians go to the community, hold a kind of town hall meeting, make sure that everybody in the community was aware of what the project was trying to do, and that it was very much for them, that it wasn't about sensationalising what had happened to them. It wasn't going into a kind of over-dramatised documentary-style production. It was about the experience of the community being documented for the benefit of the community itself and for broader public understanding now and in future of what these, let's face it, horrific natural disasters entail, how they're experienced by communities, the damage that they leave, but in the case of this excerpt also how communities survived and those wonderful little threads of hope and humour that come through that particular excerpt, which makes it all the more moving.
Can we trace a common perspective in the lives of Australians through this collection, our collective sense of humour represented in the collection perhaps?
That's such a great question, and a really almost a challenge I want to go away and do a little research project on. I think it's hard to say. I'm inclined to say yes. There's definitely a kind of Australianness that winds its way through the collection, whatever that is. It's like we recognise it, but we can't define it. I think what I do notice is the difference it made when the collection evolved, if you like, to include social history. So those very early recordings that we have are absolute gold for a different reason. They tend to be with better known individuals. ranging in the Hazel de Burgh collection from broadcasters, judges, architects, journalists, artists, historians, actors, scientists, musicians, and so on. So these were people who were well known, and the style of the interview at that time was quite different. You don't hear Hazel de Burgh's voice, for starters. Tape was very expensive, and she wasn't going to waste it by including her questions on the tape. So what you get is almost a monologue, and there is a certain amount of control to that. There's a certain amount of self-consciousness there. It's very formal. The interview is quite short, and so you have to listen a little bit harder for that natural humour, for that gentleness. I think that's what comes through when people start to relax. That's the skill of the oral historian, is to get somebody to a point where, despite speaking into a microphone and being even in a studio in some cases, they can start to feel relaxed in the retelling of their story, and then you start to get those quirks, those recognisable traits coming through in the way that people tell their stories. So I think it's a really interesting difference. That big project, the Australia 1938 project, which is a bicentennial project conducted between 1978 and 84, was the first foray into social history, and that's a completely different kind of oral history. I'm so glad that occurred, because I think that is how we do get a sense of an incredibly complex but recognisable national identity in some way. The collection is of interest to researchers in the field of linguistics, for example, because you can trace all sorts of changes in the way that we pronounce words, in the turns of phrase that we use. And in those earlier interviews, you really do hear, I suppose, what might be called an educated Australian accent. It sounds rather sort of queenly and very English to our ear today. And it's absolutely one of the fascinations of the collection, to trace changes in accent, especially as migration patterns become clear over the history of the collection, which becomes effectively the history of the last century.
Barbara, it's a wonderful collection. I'd like to tell listeners where they can find the podcast and how they can access the book.
Yes, so the podcast, The Memory Tapes, will be released from the 3rd of August on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. But you can also find it via the National Library's website. So that's library.gov.au. If you do a search through the homepage for Memory Tapes, you'll find that pop up. The accompanying book by the same title, The Memory Tapes, will be released on the 15th of August, and that will be available in bookshops nationally as well as online. It can be ordered via the National Library bookshop, pre-ordered for those who would like to.
Dr. Barbara Lemon, thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
It was my very great pleasure. Thank you.
I've been talking to Dr. Barbara Lemon about the National Library of Australia's new book and podcast series, The Memory Tapes, Voices from the Oral History Collection. The book and podcast are available at the National Library of Australia's website, and you can find more information at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.